Ed Cohen with the School of Social Work at San Jose State University. I want to talk to you about the elevator speech. The elevator speech is a chance for you to summarize your research project in a very short time. So imagine you're on the 10th floor of a building and you're in an elevator, much like the elevator we're in right now. And your boss gets on the elevator and you realize you only have about 5 minutes to tell your boss about this fantastic idea for a project that you have. The purpose of the elevator speech is for you to summarize your project as efficiently and effectively as possible. For a research project, that's a little trickier because there's a lot to say, but it's important to be able to understand your project and be able to verbalize it with somebody so that it doesn't take longer to talk about it than it would be for someone to read it. So we'll practice, we'll give you an example of an elevator speech. Just to remind you, for the research project, you want to talk about a brief title, the title of your project. You want to mention the purpose of the project and why you're doing it. You want to mention why it's important to do this project. You want to mention the research questions. It's very important to get to the research questions. You don't have to summarize the whole literature review, just a few points that really justify why you're doing this project. And then a brief summary of the methods. You don't have to cover every single part of the method section. Then summarize the results without statistics, just general summary, and then a conclusion on why the data had answered your research question and what implications the project has for social work and for the profession. So we might get interrupted, but that's okay. This is real life, and we'll do an example of an elevator speech. To see how well I do, we got a stopwatch, and I'll set the stopwatch and I'll just go ahead. It's important to not try to rush, but you don't have a lot of time to talk, but you don't have to rush your speech. So let's see how it goes. Start. So the project I'm going to talk about is entitled Use of Mental Health Services by Youth and Children in Juvenile Detention Facilities. This is a study that takes place in California about mental health services and medications that are provided to youth in juvenile detention facilities. These are locked jail incarceration facilities in California. The reason I did this study was I was concerned about the amount of mental health services and medications that are provided to youth. As you might know, according to the literature review, youth in juvenile detention who have a mental illness, well, let me put it this way, youth with a mental illness are overrepresented in juvenile detention. That means that if there's a very high proportion of those kids who have some type of diagnosable mental disorder. The proportions could be as high as 70% in some localities. So it's very high, and it's much higher than the proportion of youth who could be diagnosed with an emotional disorder in the general population. There's a lot of reasons for that I won't go in, and so, but it does have policy implications about how we decide whether to detain a youth versus provide community alternatives. In addition, there are other factors that affect the proportions of these youth in these kinds of facilities. And one of the context issues that I studied was the impact of a state placement policy. In 2007, the state of California implemented what was called juvenile justice realignment. Prior to that point, kids with very serious violent and nonviolent offenses were sent to state placement camps for as long as a year or longer, or in some cases until they were 21. There was a lawsuit about these places that led people to think that they weren't the best situations for these youth. Youth were getting abused by staff, they were getting hurt, and the treatment was less than optimal. So there was a big movement in California, and in fact the same across the entire country, to reduce or close these state placements and have youth cared for back in their local counties, in their communities. And so I was interested to see what the impact of this placement policy was on the number of youth who maybe be using mental health services and psychotropic medications in juvenile detention facilities. There's not much literature on that, so that's another reason why I was interested in this study. I analyzed 8 years of data from the state of California. Each county probation department is responsible to submit data every month on the populations in their juvenile detention facilities. And two of the questions that they answer, among many others, are how many of those youth currently on the day that they were counting have what they call an open mental health episode. which is an indication of whether or not they're getting treatment, and how many of those youth are taking psychotropic medications. So they do track the use of medications. So I downloaded the data from a publicly available website. This data were mainly counts and percentages, so we didn't have identifiable information, and I didn't need any approvals to do this research because the data were publicly available. We downloaded the data and then looked at quarters and months so that we could do an analysis to see what the impact was of this policy. As it turns out, 17% of youth in California detention facilities are on psychotropic medications at any given time, and that's pretty much reflected by another similar study in another state. As many as 35 to 40% of those youth are receiving mental health services. That may or may not be sufficient. It may not be sufficient because if you think about 75% in some studies of those youth in facilities who have some type of emotional problem. So more youth need treatment than are getting it currently in these facilities. The impact of the state placement was that, in fact, we found through multiple regression models that a proportion of these youth receiving mental health services and getting psychotropic medications increased at the time of the policy change. That's not necessarily good news. It meant that at the time, the state's policy worked from the state's point of view because they really did empty those state residential treatment beds a lot. So those beds were virtually eliminated. But what happened at the county level? We think that those kids who had emotional problems were funneled back into detention facilities rather than using the money that the counties got for the realignment to open up community-based facilities. So this is a pretty important red flag, I think, for how policy is made and what counties have to do in order to provide diversion and long-term mental health treatment for kids who are prone to have mental health problems as well as involvement with the juvenile justice system. So that was the elevator speech. We're about 16 seconds over 5 minutes, so that's not bad. The elevator didn't open. I'm kind of surprised that nobody got on, but if they did, then I'd probably tell them about the study as well, even though they wouldn't want to hear it. But I got my point across. So try it. It's a very good way to actually focus your thinking about your research study because it forces you to think about your research questions. It forces you to know your study well enough so that you can state it to somebody in a short period of time. So good luck with yours, and I look forward to hearing your own elevator speeches.